They say you spend the first half of your life caring for your children, and if you're lucky, they spend the second half of theirs caring for you. But what happens when caring for you really means caring for your money? What happens when their love has a price tag and their patience has an expiration date? I'm Paula, I'm 72 years old, and I learned the answer to that question the hard way. My children thought I was losing my mind. They thought my memory was fading, that I was becoming a confused, frail old woman who needed to be protected from herself. They were half right. I was a woman who needed protection, but it wasn't from myself, it was from them. They hired a nurse to document my decline, to build a case for taking control of everything my husband and I had built. They saw her as a pawn in their game. What they didn't know was that she was my queen, and I had put her on the board long before they even knew we were playing chess. This isn't just a story about greed. It's a story about what happens when a mother's love is met with a calculator, and what you're forced to do when the people you brought into this world try to quietly, gently, and lovingly erase you from it. The silence in this house is different now. It used to be a heavy, waiting silence, the kind that settles in after a great love has left, and you're the only one left to hear the floors creak. After my husband Richard passed, the quiet was a monument to him. Now it's a fortress. It's the sound of victory, and let me tell you, victory sounds a lot like a well-oiled grandfather clock ticking in an empty hall. It began, as these things so often do, with concern. Not genuine concern, the kind that shows up with soup when you have the flu. This was a sharp, predatory concern, dressed up in the language of love. It started with phone calls from my son, Neil. He'd call in the middle of the day. "Mom, did you take your pills? Mom, did you remember your doctor's appointment?" At first I was touched. Neil, who for 45 years had barely remembered my birthday without a reminder from his wife, was suddenly my personal scheduler. Then my daughter Megan joined the chorus. Her approach was more subtle, more insidious. She'd visit and her eyes wouldn't be on me, they'd be on the house. She'd run a finger over the dusty mantelpiece, a small, disappointed frown on her face. "Oh, Mom, this place is getting to be too much for you, isn't it?" She'd say it with a sigh, as if the burden of my existence was already settling on her slender shoulders. I wasn't a fool. I might have silver in my hair and a roadmap of wrinkles around my eyes, but my mind was as clear as it was the day I passed the bar exam 40 years ago. I'd retired, yes. I'd slowed down, certainly, but I was not senile. I knew exactly what was happening. Neil's latest innovative tech startup had crashed and burned, leaving him with a mountain of debt. Megan's husband had lost his bonus, and her carefully curated life of country clubs and European holidays was under threat. They smelled money, my money. The nest egg Richard and I had painstakingly built, not for them, but for us, for our old age. And now I was in my old age, and they had decided my time was up. The final straw, the moment the charade of loving concern was dropped, and the cold, hard truth was laid bare, came on a Tuesday. They called it a family meeting. They sat opposite me on the velvet couch Richard had picked out, their faces arranged in masks of solemn sympathy. Neil looking earnest and uncomfortable in a tie he'd clearly put on for the occasion. Megan dabbing at a dry eye with a tissue. "Mom," Neil began, his voice cracking with rehearsed emotion, "we're worried. We're so worried about you. You've been forgetting things." I stared at him. "Forgetting things," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Like what, Neil?" "Like the $20,000 I lent you last spring that you forgot to pay back." He flinched, a flicker of genuine anger in his eyes, before the mask was back in place. "See, this is what we mean. You get so defensive, confused. Megan jumped in, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. The other day you told me the story about meeting Dad twice in one afternoon, and you left the stove on last week. I had not left the stove on. I had been reheating soup, and had turned it off the moment I was done. It was a lie so blatant and clumsy it was almost insulting. As for the story, I had repeated it. True, I was testing her. I'd told it once in the morning, and then again when she visited in the afternoon, just to see if she was listening or just waiting for me to stop talking. Her reaction told me everything. We just think you need some help, Neil said, getting to the point. Someone to be here, to make sure you're safe. We've found someone, Megan added a little too brightly. A home nurse. Her name is Sarah. She's wonderful. So kind, so patient. She can help with meals, make sure you take your medication, and just be a companion. And that's when I saw it. The flicker of triumph that passed between them, the shared glance that said, she's buying it. They thought they had me. They thought they were installing a spy, a witness who would dutifully document every minor slip, every moment of normal age-related forgetfulness, and twist it into a narrative of incompetence. They were going to build a file, a medical-looking dossier of my declining mental state, and march it into a courtroom to petition for guardianship. They were going to strip me of my autonomy, my home, my dignity, and my money, all under the guise of love. I looked at their eager, greedy faces, the faces of the two babies I had held in my arms, and I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. It was the chilling realization that my children had become strangers, or worse, they had become exactly who they'd always been, and I had simply refused to see it. I took a slow breath. I let them see the tears that welled in my eyes. They were real tears, tears of profound, soul-crushing grief, but they mistook them for tears of fear and confusion. "Oh, Mom," Megan cooed, rushing forward to pat my hand. "It's for the best. You'll see. Sarah starts on Monday." I nodded, letting my chin tremble. "Okay, darlings," I whispered. "If you think it's best." Their relief was palpable. They hugged me, their bodies stiff and awkward. They left quickly, promising to call, promising to visit. As the front door clicked shut, I wiped my eyes. The grief was still there, a hard, cold stone in my gut. But something else was there now, too. A sliver of ice, a flicker of fire. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. At that moment, it was about survival. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. And they had no idea that the game they had just started was one I had been preparing to play for a very, very long time. They thought they were hiring a nurse named Sarah. They had no idea I had already hired a journalist named Kat. The days between that Tuesday and the following Monday were the longest of my life. The house, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. Every familiar object seemed to mock me. The photograph on the mantelpiece of a younger Neil and Megan, smiling gap-toothed in the summer sun, felt like a cruel joke. Where did those children go? When did their open, loving faces curdle into the avaricious masks I'd seen on the couch? I would sit in Richard's old leather armchair, the one with the worn patches on the arms, and let the memories wash over me. It was a painful, necessary exercise. I had to understand how we got here. People don't just wake up one day and decide to betray their mother. It's a slow erosion, a death by 1,000 cuts, and I had been bleeding for years without even realizing it. I remembered Neil in his 20s, full of grand ideas and no follow-through. His first business was a custom t-shirt company run out of our garage. He'd bought $1,000 worth of blank shirts with a loan from Richard. A month later, the shirts were still in their boxes, and Neil was on to his next big thing, day trading. He lost $5,000 in a week. Richard was furious. I was the peacemaker. He's just finding his way, darling, I'd said, writing a check from our joint account to cover the loss. Richard had looked at me, his eyes full of a weary sadness I didn't understand at the time. Paula, he said, a life raft isn't meant to be a permanent address, but I kept throwing him life rafts. There was the gourmet food truck that never sold a single taco, the app that was supposed to revolutionize the pet sitting industry but never got coded, the import-export scheme that turned out to be just exporting money from our savings account to his. Each time he'd come to us, full of shame and promises. This is the last time, Mom. I've learned my lesson, and each time I'd believed him. Because I wanted to, because the alternative was to admit my son was a failure, not of circumstance, but of character. It was easier to blame bad luck than to accept a bad seed. And Megan, my beautiful bright Megan, her sense of entitlement was a quieter, more insidious vine. It wasn't about failed businesses, it was about a curated existence she felt she was owed. I remembered her 16th birthday. All she wanted was a specific designer purse, one that cost more than our first car. We said no. It was an obscene amount of money for a teenager's handbag. She didn't scream or cry. She just withdrew. For a month she treated me with a cool, polite disappointment. Every please and thank you was a tiny, sharp jab. She made me feel like I had failed her, like my love was deficient because it didn't come with a 4-figure price tag. In the end I caved. Richard was out of town on business, and I took money from my personal savings, the mad money my own mother had told me to always keep, and bought the purse. When I gave it to her, she didn't even look surprised. She just said, "I knew you'd come around," and took it. There was no hug, no effusive thanks, just the quiet satisfaction of a queen whose tribute had finally been delivered. That pattern repeated itself through the years. The down payment on her first apartment, which was in a neighborhood far more expensive than she could afford. The funding for her interior design course, which seemed to consist mostly of shopping for overpriced furniture for her own home. The private school tuition for her children because the local public school simply wouldn't do. She and her husband Mark earned a perfectly good living, but it was never enough to support the image they wanted to project. So they'd come to us. It was never a request, always a statement of need presented as an opportunity for us to show our love. The unspoken threat was always there. Deny us this and you deny us your grandchildren. You deny us our affection. It wasn't about being ungenerous. Richard and I were always happy to help, but help is a hand up, not a lifelong handout. We wanted to see them stand on their own 2 feet, to feel the pride of building something for themselves. But they didn't want to build, they wanted to inherit. The most painful memory, the one that truly cemented my resolve, was from the last few months of Richard's life. He was weak, confined mostly to his bed. The illness had stripped away all pretense. One evening I was sitting with him, holding his hand, when he turned his head on the pillow and looked at me. His eyes were clear and piercingly sad. "They were here today," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. I knew who they were. Neil and Megan had visited that afternoon while I was at the pharmacy. "That's nice, darling," I said, stroking his hand. He shook his head slightly. "No, it wasn't. They asked me about the will, Paula. They wanted to know if I'd updated it recently." Neil was talking about power of attorney. He said it would be easier for everyone. My blood ran cold. To come into this room, to see their father so frail and vulnerable, and to think only of the money, it was monstrous. I'm sorry, Richard, I whispered, a hot lump of shame and anger forming in my throat. I'm so sorry, he squeezed my hand, a faint pressure. It's not your fault, it's ours. We gave them everything, but we forgot to teach them the value of anything. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound. Be careful, Paula. When I'm gone, be careful. The wolves will circle. Don't let them mistake your kindness for weakness. I made him a promise that night, a quiet, solemn vow in the dim light of his sick room. I would protect what we had built. I would protect his memory. For 2 years after he passed, I tried to honor that promise by keeping the peace, by continuing to be the accommodating, loving mother. I thought that maybe without their father's formidable presence to push against, they would mature. I was wrong. His absence just made them bolder. They saw me not as a grieving widow, but as a weakened gatekeeper. So when they sat on my couch and announced the arrival of Sarah, it was Richard's voice I heard in my head. Be careful, Paula. The wolves will circle. The wolves were no longer circling. They were in my living room, disguised as my children. That was the moment the grief turned to steel. My despair didn't vanish, but it crystallized into a hard, sharp purpose. It wasn't about revenge then. It was about honoring the promise I made to my dying husband. I would not be a victim. I would not be a footnote in my own life story, a sad tale of an old woman swindled by her greedy kids. I would be the author of the final chapter. I went to my office, the room that had once been the hub of my legal research, and I sat down at the heavy oak desk. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The catalyst wasn't one single event, but the crushing weight of all of them combined. It was Neil's failed businesses, Megan's designer purse, their questions about the will at my husband's deathbed, and now this final, unforgivable insult of a spy in my own home. My hands stopped shaking. My breathing steadied. I wasn't a confused old woman. I was a lawyer. I was a wife, I was a mother, and I was about to go to war. I remembered an article I had bookmarked months ago, a long-form piece in a national magazine, about a journalist who specialized in undercover investigations of elder abuse. Her name was Catherine Vance. I found the article, read her bio, and then I did something I hadn't done in years. I began to build a case. My first move was not one of panic, but of quiet, calculated foresight. This plan didn't spring into being the day Neil and Megan ambushed me. It had been germinating for months, a seed of suspicion planted long ago that was finally terrifyingly starting to sprout. The intrusive questions about my finances had started subtly after Richard died. Little things. Megan asking who managed my portfolio. Neil idly wondering if the house was paid off. They were testing the waters, and I felt the chill. So long before the intervention, I started my own quiet investigation. I wasn't just a grieving widow, I was a retired attorney with a healthy dose of professional paranoia. I started documenting everything. I saved Neil's wheedling emails asking for short-term loans. I made notes after every phone call with Megan where she'd casually inquire about the value of my jewelry or the art on my walls. It felt grubby and awful, like I was spying on my own children, but Richard's warning echoed in my mind. Be careful, Paula. The real turning point came about 3 months before they hired Sarah. I'd been reading an online edition of The Atlantic and came across a stunning piece of journalism. It was a deep dive expose on abuses within luxury assisted living facilities. The writer had gone undercover as an orderly for 6 months, documenting neglect and financial exploitation with a novelist's eye for detail and a prosecutor's dedication to fact. Her name was Catherine Vance, but the byline mentioned she was often called Cat. She had a reputation for being relentless, ethical, and a fierce advocate for the vulnerable. The article won a slew of awards. I saved it. I didn't know why, not exactly. It was just a gut feeling, a survival instinct I didn't know I still possessed. Then, about a month later, I got a call from my old friend, Isabel. Isabel and I had known each other since college. She owned a small, prestigious art gallery downtown and had a wit as sharp as a shard of glass. She was my rock, the one person I could be completely honest with. "Paula," she said, her voice devoid of its usual breezy cheer, "I just had the strangest lunch with Megan." "Oh?" I asked, settling into my armchair. "She spent the entire time asking about you, but not in a normal way. She wanted to know if I thought you were, if I'd noticed you being forgetful. She even asked if you ever talked about end-of-life planning with me." It felt ghoulish. That was it. That was the confirmation I needed. My children weren't just greedy. They were actively laying the groundwork for a coup. They were polling my friends, trying to build a consensus that I was losing my faculties. After I hung up with Isabel, I went to my desk, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. I found the article by Catherine Vance. It took me another week to build up the nerve, but I finally sent an email to the generic contact address on her professional website. I didn't expect a reply. A journalist of her stature must get 1,000 emails a day from crackpots and conspiracy theorists. But I wrote it anyway. I laid out the facts simply and clearly, just as I would have in a legal brief. I mentioned my background as an attorney, the size of the estate, my children's financial troubles, and my growing suspicion that they were planning to have me declared incompetent. I attached a few of Neil's more pathetic emails and a summary of my conversation with Isabel. I ended it with a simple line: "They believe my kindness is weakness. I want to hire you to prove them wrong." 2 days later, my phone rang. It was an unlisted number. "Is this Paula Gable?" a voice asked. It was crisp, professional, and younger than I expected. "It is. This is Catherine Vance. I got your email, your story. It's compelling and depressingly common. I'm interested. Can we meet?" We met at a quiet corner table in the cafe of the city's modern art museum. It was Isabel's suggestion, neutral territory, lots of people around, but enough ambient noise for privacy. Cat Vance was not what I expected. She was in her late 30s, with an intense, intelligent gaze and an air of coiled energy. She wasn't dressed like a hard-hitting reporter. She wore a simple black sweater and jeans. She looked more like a graduate student than a Pulitzer winner. She listened without interruption for nearly an hour, as I told her everything, from Neil's first failed business to Megan's questions at Richard's bedside. I showed her the file I'd been keeping, the emails, the dates, the notes. I could see the initial professional skepticism in her eyes slowly transform into focused interest. "They haven't made their move yet," she said when I was finished. "Right now it's just circumstantial. A good lawyer could paint this as the actions of concerned, if clumsy, children." "I know," I said. "That's why I need you. They will make a move, and when they do, I want to be ready. They think they're hunting, but I want to be the one setting the trap." "And what's the bait?" she asked, her eyes sharp. "Me," I said simply. "And a nurse. I have a feeling they're going to try to install someone in my house to watch me, to build their case. I want you to be that person." A slow smile spread across her face. "You want me to go undercover, as your nurse. Can you do it?" "I've been a factory worker, a waitress, and a prison guard. I think I can handle playing a kindly caregiver," she said. But it's a huge risk for both of us. If they find out, your relationship with your children is irrevocably destroyed. They destroyed it when they started valuing my bank account more than my well-being, I said, the coldness in my voice surprising even myself. What I need is undeniable proof, the kind of proof you get with a hidden camera. We spent the next 2 hours mapping it out. Kat was meticulous. We created the persona of Sarah Miller. We built her a backstory, a gentle, slightly naive woman from a small town, recently certified as a nursing assistant, looking for a quiet live-in position. Kat even took a weekend course to get a legitimate CNA certification to make it airtight. We bought a simple, unassuming uniform. The real genius, though, was the technology. Kat had a contact who supplied her with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. The camera was a button on her uniform blouse. The microphone was a tiny chip woven into the collar. The quality, she assured me, was broadcast level. While Kat prepared her identity, I fortified my own position. I met with my estate lawyer, a sharp woman named Mrs. Jennings, who had taken over the practice from her father, who had been Richard's lawyer for 30 years. I didn't tell her the whole plan. It was better if she had plausible deniability, but I had her walk me through every line of Richard's will. It was a fortress, just as he had intended. Most of the estate was held in a testamentary trust. I was the primary beneficiary and the sole trustee for my lifetime. This gave me complete control, but the crucial part was the distribution clause for after I was gone. Richard had insisted on it. It gave the successor trustee a position that would be filled by a neutral corporate entity, not Neil or Megan, absolute discretion to distribute the assets based on their judgment of the beneficiary's demonstrated character, financial prudence, and filial respect. It was a morality clause, and it was ironclad. And what about a no contest clause? I asked Mrs. Jennings. It's in there. Standard boilerplate, she confirmed. Anyone who formally challenges the will or the actions of the trustee in court forfeits their entire inheritance. Your husband was a very smart man, Paula. He was, I thought. He knew his children better than I did. My final piece of preparation was with Isabel. I finally told her the whole plan. She sat in stunned silence in her immaculate minimalist living room, a cup of herbal tea forgotten in her hand. My God, Paula, she breathed. It's diabolical and brilliant. Are you sure you can go through with it, pretending to be frail, letting them think they're winning? What choice do I have, Izzy? I asked her, my voice weary. Let them ship me off to a home and bleed my accounts dry. This isn't just about money, it's about dignity. Richard worked his entire life for what we have. I will not let it be squandered by two greedy, entitled children who think hard work is for other people. Isabel stood up and walked over to her window, looking out over the city lights. They've underestimated you your entire life, haven't they? They always saw you as the soft one, the peacemaker, the open wallet. She turned back to me, her eyes blazing with protective fire. Okay, what do you need me to do? Just be my friend, I said. And maybe start asking your own questions. If Megan calls you again, sound a little more concerned. Agree with her. Let them think the world is on their side. Isabel nodded, a slow, predatory smile forming on her face. Oh, I can do that. Consider it performance art. So when Neil and Megan sat on my couch and announced they'd found a wonderful nurse named Sarah, I was ready. I had my asset in place. I had my legal framework secured. I had my ally briefed. They thought they were beginning a quiet, gentle takeover. They had no idea they were walking, hand in hand, directly into the crosshairs of a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. and a mother who had finally had enough. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for them to spring it. The Monday that Sarah was due to arrive felt like the opening night of a play I hadn't properly rehearsed. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I had to be frail Paula, confused Paula, vulnerable Paula. I, who had once cross-examined hostile witnesses without breaking a sweat, had to perform the role of a doddering old woman for an audience of two my own children. Kat arrived precisely at 9 a.m., right on cue. She looked the part perfectly. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, neat bun. She wore the drab blue scrubs we'd picked out, and her face was scrubbed clean of makeup. She carried a single, sensible tote bag. She was the picture of gentle, unassuming competence. Neil and Megan were already there, of course. They had let themselves in with their key, and were drinking coffee at my kitchen island as if they owned the place. They greeted Kat at the door with a cloying warmth that made my stomach turn. "Sarah, thank you so much for coming," Megan gushed, taking her arm. "We are so relieved to have you here. Mom has just been having a bit of a tough time lately." "It's my pleasure," Kat said, her voice soft and just a little bit timid. It was a masterful performance. "I'm just happy to help." They led her into the living room where I was sitting in my armchair, a shawl draped over my shoulders. I looked up, feigning confusion. "Oh, hello. Who is this?" "Mom, this is Sarah," Neil said, speaking slowly and loudly, as if I were deaf as well as demented. "The nurse we told you about. She's here to help you." "Oh," I said, my voice thin and reedy. "That's nice." I gave Kat a watery, unfocused smile. She smiled back, a picture of kindness. The tiny black button on her blouse glinted for a second under the lamplight. The show had begun. The first few days were a master class in manipulation, and every second of it was being captured in high-definition video and audio. Neil and Megan hovered, determined to onboard Sarah properly. Their instructions were a horrifying mix of condescension and conspiracy. On the first afternoon, Megan pulled Kat into the kitchen while I was napping on the couch. I wasn't napping, of course. I was listening to every word, my body tense. "Okay, so here's the kind of thing that's really important to document," Megan said in a conspiratorial whisper. Kat's tote bag, containing a secondary recording device, was on the counter between them. This morning she couldn't find her favorite coffee mug. She looked for 10 minutes. That's short-term memory loss. You need to write that down. Time, date, and a little note about how agitated she seemed. "Agitated?" Kat asked, her voice full of innocent confusion. "She seemed fine to me. She just said she must have put it in the wrong cupboard." Megan sighed, a sound of profound theatrical patience. "Sarah, sweetie, you have to learn to read between the lines. An elderly person getting agitated might not look like a tantrum. It's a frantic energy, a confusion in the eyes. Just right, appeared agitated. The lawyers will know what it means." "The lawyers," she said it so casually, it sent a chill down my spine. The next day it was Neil's turn. I was in the garden, snipping dead heads off my roses, with Kat trailing me. Neil called her phone. I watched as Kat answered, her face a perfect mask of professional concern. She put the phone on speaker, pretending to need her hands free to hold my basket. Neil's voice, tinny and urgent, filled the quiet garden air. "Is she talking about Dad again?" he asked, not even bothering with a hello. "Yes, Mr. Gable," Kat said. "She was just telling me about the beautiful climbing rose he planted for her." "Okay, good, good. Write that down," he ordered. "Use the phrase fixated on the past. And if she tells you the same story more than once, that's confabulatory repetition. Got it? Confabulatory repetition. It sounds very clinical. It's very effective. I had to physically turn away so they wouldn't see the fury on my face. Confabulatory repetition. He'd clearly been spending his evenings on second-rate legal websites, arming himself with a terrifyingly inaccurate vocabulary. He was coaching a witness. He was conspiring to commit fraud, and it was all being recorded. My own performance was exhausting. I had to force myself to be the person they wanted to see. I would forget where I put my reading glasses 5 minutes after taking them off. I would stand in the middle of a room looking lost and ask Kat what I came in there for. I would tell her the story of meeting Richard 3 times in 1 week, each time feigning the delight of a first telling. Each evening after my children had gone home, congratulating themselves on their cleverness, Kat and I would have our debrief. She would transfer the day's footage from her devices to a secure, encrypted hard drive. We'd sit in my office, the door locked, and watch the dailies like 2 film producers. Seeing it played back was sickening. The way Megan's voice dripped with false sympathy, the way Neil's eyes darted around the room, assessing the value of every object. They weren't my children anymore. They were vultures, circling what they believed to be a dying animal. "The footage is incredible, Paula," Kat said one night, her professional excitement warring with her obvious disgust. "It's so much more than I expected. They aren't even trying to be subtle. They're explicitly telling me to falsify a medical record. This is a slam dunk." "Just a little longer," I urged, though the charade was grating on my soul. I want them to be so confident, so utterly sure of their victory, that the fall is that much harder. The reports Kat sent to them were works of art. She used their own coached phrases, embedding them in a narrative of gentle decline. Patient seemed confused about the date this morning, claimed it was Wednesday when it is clearly Thursday, became agitated when looking for her checkbook, engaged in confabulatory repetition regarding her late husband. Neil's response was a single triumphant text, "Perfect. Keep it coming." They started to relax their guard completely. They'd have conversations in front of Sarah, as if she were a piece of furniture. One afternoon I was dozing in my chair when Neil and Megan came to visit. They thought I was asleep. They were standing in the hall just outside the living room, but Kat was in the room with me, dusting, and the microphone on her collar was powerful. "Mark's brother is a lawyer," Megan whispered. "He said with another month of these reports from the nurse, we'll have enough to file the petition. He said a judge won't even question it when we have daily logs from a certified caregiver." "And the house?" Neil asked, his voice greedy. "Once we have guardianship we can sell it, right? Pay off my debts and give you and Mark a cushion?" "Of course," Megan said dismissively. "We'll move her into a nice facility, something clean. She won't know the difference. It's for her own good, Neil. She'll be safer, and we'll be secure." "She won't know the difference." The words echoed in the silent room. I lay there feigning sleep, my body rigid with a white-hot rage. It wasn't about the money. It was about that sentence, the casual, cruel dismissal of my entire being. They were planning to dispose of me like a piece of worn-out furniture. The silent takeover was nearly complete in their minds. They were already spending my money, redecorating my life, and choosing my tomb. My grief for the children I had lost was finally completely burned away by the fire of my anger. It was no longer about survival. It was about justice, and I was going to make sure it was served cold. The first crack in their perfect plan came from an unexpected quarter. My friend Isabel, playing her part as the concerned, sympathetic friend, she had started a subtle but brilliant campaign of social sabotage. She operated with the precision of a surgeon, making tiny, incisive cuts into Neil and Megan's credibility within our small, interconnected community of old friends and extended family. Whenever Megan would call her to check in and fish for more evidence of my decline, Isabel would be a fountain of agreement. "Oh yes, you're right to be worried, dear," she'd say, her voice dripping with fake empathy. "Paula does seem a bit scattered. Thank goodness she has you two looking out for her." Then an hour later, Isabel would call me, and we'd have a good bitter laugh about it. But then Isabel would make another call. She'd ring up my cousin Eleanor or an old friend from the garden club. "I'm so worried about Neil and Megan," she'd say, her tone now one of genuine sounding distress. "They seem so stressed. They're hovering over Paula constantly. I think their concern, while well-intentioned, might be smothering her." I tried to call Paula directly the other day, and Neil insisted on mediating the call. It was so odd. It was a beautiful passive-aggressive strategy. She wasn't accusing them of anything. She was just painting a picture of two overbearing, controlling children and one poor, smothered mother. The seeds of doubt she planted began to grow. People started calling me directly on my private cell number that my children didn't have. "Paula, darling, how are you really?" my cousin Eleanor asked one afternoon. "Megan makes it sound like you're on your last legs, but you sound perfectly fine to me." "I have good days and bad days, Eleanor," I said, sticking to the script. "But it's lovely to hear your voice." Neil and Megan started to notice. The invitations to Sunday dinners at my brother's house suddenly stopped coming to them and started coming directly to me. When Megan ran into an old family friend at the grocery store, the woman was noticeably cool to her. They were being subtly, quietly, and inexplicably pushed to the fringes of the family's inner circle. Their panic was a slow burn. "Something's going on," I overheard Megan telling Neil on the phone, her voice tight with frustration. Kat was in the kitchen, ostensibly cleaning out the refrigerator, the whole conversation being recorded. Aunt Carol barely spoke to me at the charity luncheon. "It's like people are avoiding me. Are they talking to Mom behind our backs? Let them." Neil scoffed, though I could hear the anxiety in his voice. "It doesn't matter. Once the guardianship is in place, we'll be the ones managing her social calendar." What are they going to do? Their response to this growing social pressure wasn't to back off, but to double down. Their desperation made them sloppy. They decided they needed to accelerate the timeline. They needed a big, definitive event to solidify their case. They decided to call a family summit with my younger brother David. David was a good man, but a soft touch. He was a retired accountant, methodical and risk-averse. He loved me, but he hated confrontation. Neil and Megan saw him as the perfect pawn, a respectable family member whose endorsement would give their petition an unassailable air of legitimacy. If Uncle David agreed that Paula needed help, who could argue? They set the meeting for a Saturday afternoon at my house. They were so confident. They had their star witness, Sarah, and her meticulously fabricated logs of my decline. They saw this as the final step before victory. The day before the meeting, Kat and I finalized our own preparations. We edited together a short video, a greatest hits of their conspiracy. It was 5 minutes of pure, unadulterated villainy. It opened with Megan in the kitchen, instructing Kat to document my agitation. It cut to Neil's voice in the garden, defining confabulatory repetition. Then the crown jewel, the audio from the hallway, their hushed conversation about selling my house and putting me in a nice facility where I wouldn't know the difference. Watching it, my hands were clenched into fists. "It's perfect," I whispered. "Are you ready for this, Paula?" Kat asked, her eyes soft with concern. "Tomorrow there's no going back." I thought of Richard's face in those final days. I thought of his warning. I thought of my children's faces, twisted with greed. I thought of the condescending way Neil had spoken to me the dismissive cruelty in Megan's voice. I have never been more ready for anything in my life, I said. It's not about revenge until it is. And for me, that moment is tomorrow. The power had already shifted. They just didn't know it yet. They were walking into a family meeting, but it was going to be a trial, and I was no longer the defendant. I was the judge. The air in my living room on that Saturday afternoon was thick with tension. It was a strange, toxic cocktail of feigned sympathy and raw ambition. My brother David sat awkwardly on the edge of the sofa, his face a mask of worried sincerity. He'd always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over arguments and brokered truces. He was completely out of his depth here, and Neil and Megan were counting on it. My children were in their element. They flanked him, playing their roles to perfection. Megan, dressed in a somber navy blue dress, dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a linen handkerchief. Neil, in a crisp shirt, paced in front of the fireplace, his brow furrowed with a pantomime of grave concern. I sat in my armchair, the shawl around my shoulders, looking frail and small. Kat, my dear Sarah, stood quietly by the door, ready to be called upon as their star witness. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she looked nervous. It was a brilliant touch. "Thank you for coming, Uncle David," Megan began, her voice trembling slightly. "We know this is difficult, but we just didn't know who else to turn to." "We're at our wits' end," Neil chimed in, stopping his pacing to fix David with a look of earnest desperation. "We love Mom more than anything, but we can't stand by and watch her fade away. She's not safe here by herself anymore." David looked over at me, his eyes full of pity. "What do you say to this?" I looked up, my eyes wide and a little unfocused. I let a moment of silence hang in the air. "I get confused sometimes," I mumbled, playing my part to the hilt. "But I like my house." The words were designed to be both pathetic and childish, and they landed perfectly. Megan shot Neil a look that said, "See? That's exactly what we mean," Neil said, seizing the moment. "She's confused. She doesn't understand the risks. Just last week she left the back door unlocked all night, and she keeps losing things. Important things, her checkbook, her keys." "We hired Sarah to help," Megan continued, gesturing toward Kat. "And her daily logs, well, they paint a very clear picture. Sarah, could you perhaps share a few of your observations from this past month?" This was it, the moment of the turn. Kat stepped forward, clutching a small notebook. She looked at Neil and Megan, then at David, and finally at me. She took a deep breath. "Actually," she said, her voice suddenly losing its timid, mousy quality and gaining a new, crisp authority, "I think it would be better if you saw for yourselves." Before anyone could react, she reached into her sensible tote bag and pulled out not the notebook, but a sleek, modern tablet. Her fingers flew across the screen. Neil and Megan stared, confused. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Neil demanded, his tone shifting from concerned son to angry employer. "My name," she said, her voice ringing with clarity in the silent room, "is not Sarah Miller. It's Catherine Vance. I'm an investigative journalist with The Atlantic, and for the past month your mother has been my client." The color drained from Neil's face. Megan let out a small, strangled gasp. David just stared, his mouth hanging open. I pushed the shawl from my shoulders and sat up straight in my chair. The frail, confused old woman vanished, replaced by the woman I truly was, clear-eyed, furious, and in complete control. "You wanted to document my declining mental state," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Well, as it turns out, we've been documenting your declining moral state, and the evidence is far more compelling. Kat turned the tablet screen toward them and pressed play. The video began. The first scene was Megan in my kitchen, her face a mask of conspiracy as she whispered to Kat, "Just right," appeared agitated. "The lawyers will know what it means." The audio was perfect, her words echoing in the horrified silence of the living room. Megan's hand flew to her mouth. Then it cut to the garden. Neil's tinny voice filled the room, condescendingly spelling out confabulatory repetition. David flinched as if he'd been struck. Neil looked like he was going to be physically sick, but Kat had saved the best for last. The final clip was just audio, played over a black screen. It was their voices from the hallway, so clear, so damning. "Neil, once we have guardianship, we can sell it, right?" "Megan, of course. We'll move her into a nice facility, something clean. She won't know the difference." When the audio faded, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with shame and exposure. Megan was openly weeping now, not the fake, theatrical tears from before, but ugly, wrenching sobs of pure shock and humiliation. Neil stood frozen, his face a mottled canvas of red and white. My brother David slowly turned his head to look at them. His expression of soft concern hardened into one of cold, utter disgust. "You," he said, his voice low and shaking with a rage I had never seen in him before, "you did this to your own mother." We were just worried." Neil stammered, the lie sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "Worried," I snapped, my voice like the crack of a whip. "You weren't worried, you were impatient. You saw me as a walking, talking bank vault, and you were tired of waiting for the key. You saw my love as a weakness to be exploited. You saw my home as your future inheritance. You never saw me at all." I stood up, feeling a strength and clarity I hadn't felt in years. "Let me make the new reality perfectly clear for you both. First, there will be no guardianship. Any petition you file will be met with this evidence, which will then be handed over to the district attorney's office for a full investigation into conspiracy to commit fraud." I let that sink in. Their eyes widened in terror. "Second," I continued, "I am invoking the discretionary and no contest clauses of your father's trust. You have demonstrated a profound lack of character and filial respect. You have actively conspired to defraud the estate. Therefore, as of this moment, you are both completely and irrevocably disinherited. You will not receive one single cent." Megan let out a wail of despair. "And finally," I said, looking at Kat, who stood there like a statue of righteous justice, "Miss Vance's story, The Inheritance Plot, is scheduled for publication next month. It will detail in excruciating detail how two wealthy, privileged children attempted to gaslight their own mother to steal her fortune. Your names, your faces, your words, they will all be there for the world to see. You wanted to take my name from me by having me declared incompetent. Instead, I'm going to let you ruin your own." I walked over to the front door and opened it. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "Both of you." They stumbled out, broken and defeated, not even looking at each other. They were no longer conspirators. They were just two disgraced individuals, cast out into the new reality they had created for themselves. As the door clicked shut behind them, I leaned against it, the adrenaline finally leaving my body. David came over and put his arm around me. "Paula," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I am so sorry. I had no idea." "I know, David," I said, patting his hand. "I know." The long, terrible performance was over. The charade was done, and in the ringing silence of my home, for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, completely safe. The aftermath was exactly as devastating for them as Kat and I had planned. Her article was a sensation. It didn't just get published, it became a cultural moment. It was titled The Dutiful Daughter, a masterpiece of irony. Kat, with my permission, used their real first names, but fictionalized the last name to give me a thin veil of privacy. It didn't matter. Everyone in our community knew exactly who Neil and Megan were. The story was picked up by national news outlets. It became a talking point on morning shows, a case study in the dark heart of entitlement. Kat Vance won her second Pulitzer for it. In her acceptance speech, she spoke of the courage of the elderly woman who refused to be a victim, who fought back not with hysterics, but with strategy. I watched the broadcast with Isabel, and we toasted the screen with glasses of the good champagne Richard had been saving. The fallout for my children was swift and total. Neil's business partners, horrified by the public exposure, pulled their funding and dissolved their partnership. He was left with nothing but the debts he'd been trying to escape. Megan's life imploded even more spectacularly. She was asked to resign from the board of her children's private school. The country club quietly revoked their membership. Her husband, Mark, a man whose entire identity was built on social standing, was humiliated. I heard through the grapevine that he left her a few months later. She was forced to sell her oversized house and move into a small rented apartment. They tried to contact me, of course. First came the angry, accusatory voicemails. "How could you do this to us? You've ruined our lives." Then, as their desperation grew, the tone shifted to pleading. There were letters, emails, even flowers left on my doorstep, all begging for forgiveness, for a second chance, for a financial lifeline. I read none of the letters. I deleted the voicemails unheard. I gave the flowers to the nice woman who cleans my house. Forgiveness is a currency they no longer had any way to earn. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about peace, and my peace required their absence. I did what I said I would. I had Mrs. Jennings formally draw up the papers, disinheriting them completely. It was a strange, hollow feeling, signing my children out of my life with a pen stroke. But it was necessary. I restructured the trust. A significant portion went to Isabel, my loyal, fierce friend. A piece went to my brother David as an apology for what his niece and nephew had put him through. But the bulk of it, the lion's share of what Richard and I had built, I used to establish a new charitable foundation in Richard's name. It provides grants for investigative journalism projects focused on elder abuse and funds legal aid for seniors fighting guardianship fraud. Kat Vance sits on the board of directors. My children's greed is now, ironically, funding the exposure of people just like them. The silence in my house is a true silence now. It's not heavy with grief or tense with waiting. It's light. It's the sound of freedom. I have my garden, my books, my friends. I travel with Isabel. We went to Italy last spring and drank wine in the Tuscan sun. My life is my own again, and it is full. So what is the moral of my story? It's not simply that greed is ugly or that you should be wary of your own family. It's that your mind is your most valuable asset. It's more precious than your house, your stocks, or your jewelry, and you have to protect it, not just from the ravages of time, but from those who would try to convince you and the world that it's already gone. They counted on me being weak, confused, and afraid. They mistook my kindness for fragility, my silence for consent. They forgot who I was, a wife who had made a promise, a lawyer who knew how to build a case, and a mother who had finally learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let your children face the consequences of their own choices. It was never about the money. It was about a single devastating question they forced me to answer. What is a mother's love worth when it's no longer being returned? As it turns out, it's worth everything. Thank you for listening to my story. If you or someone you know has faced something similar, please know you are not alone, and you are not powerless. Share your own stories in the comments below. Sometimes just being heard is the first step toward finding your strength. And if my story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know.